SPE Gaia, Society of Petroleum Engineers, OGCI, IOGP, and IPECA, and you can see the banners at the top of the slide here. And this follows on from a series of joint methane-related webinars that we held last year. My name's Jim Herbertson, and I'm the Technical Director for Climate and Energy at IPECA. And the topic today is Carbon Takeback Obligations, an opportunity to accelerate carbon capture and storage. The webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour, and we plan to divide it into 3 sections. Firstly, Myles Allen and Margriet Kuiyper will introduce the concept of the Carbon Takeback Obligation and carbon storage units. And then secondly, Martin Towns of BP and Arthur Lee of Chevron will introduce some recent work from OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, examining how Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which covers carbon markets, could fit into or facilitate this concept, and how the oil and gas sector can get involved. And finally, to round off the webinar, we will have, I hope, a Q&A section. But before we start, and if we go to the next slide, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Where this webinar is on Teams, and we hope that will help with interactivity and a broader discussion. So please mute when not speaking. And to help with bandwidth, would you please turn your video on when speaking? And of course, that's optional. But also, can you switch it off if you're not speaking or presenting? That would also help. And you can use the chat or raise hand function to make a comment or ask a question, and we'll periodically check the chat function to make sure we're not missing anything. A link to the recording and a PDF version of the slides will be sent to registrants later this week. And if I could just then kind of broaden the introduction, just to say that IPECA as an organisation, we held our first workshop on carbon capture and storage in 2003. And our most recent in 2017, which is called Making CCS Fly. And you can find the report of this workshop on our website, along with a fact sheet called Making the Case for CCS. And since 2019, we've also run webinars on different aspects of carbon capture and storage that we thought would be of interest to kind of our members and other stakeholders. And again, recordings of these webinars are available on our website. The first commercial carbon capture project dates from 1972, nearly 50 years ago, and the GCCSI annual report reports to dozens of CCS projects either operational or in planning, and tens of millions of tons of CO2 are being captured, transported and stored around the world today. But it's clear from the IPCC Special Report 1.5 and the recent AR6 Working Group 3 report on mitigation, as well as other studies such as the IEA Net Zero Roadmap, that CCS deployment in the millions of tons of CO2, both for mitigation and removal of societal CO2 emissions, is not enough. By mid-century, many of the modelled scenarios assume deployment at the level of gigatons a year to keep society on the cost-effective pathways to meeting the Paris Agreement. And this is particularly so for hard-to-abate sectors. So it's very timely that we look at how to accelerate deployment of carbon capture and storage and consider novel and different ways of encouraging its scale-up. I'll let the presenters introduce themselves as they go along. But first off, if I can, I'll hand over to you, Myles and Margriet. So Myles and Margriet, take it away. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jim. And just to double check, Jim, that everybody can hear me okay. And I'm just
certainly can hear you.
And I'll start sharing, and I hope that's all working all right as well. And what Margriet suggested was that I should introduce the concept of carbon takeback, or as I like to subtitle it, how to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. I'm Myles Allen at the School of Geography and the Department of Physics, University of Oxford, and I'm director of the Oxford Net Zero Initiative. So in a nutshell, how to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. This is energy and industrial process emissions from the scenarios that meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, limiting warming to approximately 1.5 degrees. The blue line shows net emissions to the atmosphere, in these scenarios, and the black line shows the total carbon dioxide produced from burning fossil fuels and oxidizing limestone and so forth. And obviously they're very different. We see a sort of roughly 2/3 reduction in contribution from reducing the total amount of carbon dioxide we produce. And we also see roughly the remaining third dealt with by storing more carbon dioxide back into the Earth's crust. What we've done here in producing this figure was just to separate out energy and industrial process emissions. Unfortunately, in many of the sort of slides you see coming out of the IPCC, things are sort of slightly muddled up with land use change emissions and lots of other things as well. So this is sort of in a nutshell how in these scenarios we stop fossil fuels from causing global warming by achieving what Patrick Portolano likes to say, geological net zero. So a state where we're putting carbon dioxide back into the Earth's crust at the same rate that we're liberating it by continued use of fossil fuels. And we're making some progress in this direction in that we are burning less. We're creating perhaps slightly less CO2 than we would have been creating. We're not actually going down yet, but we're not storing more. And the reason why is evident from this figure from a recent Goldman Sachs report, which shows that up until sort of 2/3 to 3/4 of our of the emission reductions we need to achieve net zero, it's cheaper to not produce CO2 than it is to store it permanently away back underground. But then we get to that final 25% and it becomes extremely expensive to reduce the production of CO2, and that's where storage is going to be needed. But if we leave it to the market to bring storage online, well, we can see it's not happening. It's not happening remotely fast enough at the moment, which introduces this idea of driving deployment of carbon storage through an application of, if you like, extended producer responsibility to fossil fuels themselves. And this is the idea behind the Carbon Takeback Obligation. So in a nutshell, it is that anyone selling fossil fuels, whether they're an extractor or an importer to a jurisdiction that imposes a Carbon Takeback Obligation, would have to certify that a fraction of all the carbon dioxide generated by those fuels, so both their own activities and their Scope 3 emissions, has been geologically sequestered. And this sequestered fraction has to rise just by simple mathematics by 3.3% per year from now on to reach net zero around 2050. So 10% by 2030, 50% by 2040, 100% by 2050. It's quite easy to do the maths. We suggested, when we originally proposed this, that the stored CO2 could be sourced from any carbon dioxide that would otherwise have ended up in the atmosphere. This keeps costs down in the short term, and we suggest that it should be a universal obligation on all fossil fuel extractors and importers, because that would allow costs to be shared throughout the fossil fuel value chain. Just to show you exactly how it would work, this is the situation we're in at the moment. We have extractors or importers of fossil fuels passing carbon dioxide embedded in the fuels they sell to industrial point sources who emit some of that directly to the atmosphere, process it into products which are passed to consumers, which is then all ends up in the atmosphere. The government and the geological storage operator in this current situation are not really doing very much. We introduced a carbon takeback obligation. Initially, only a small fraction, a few percent, of the embedded carbon dioxide in imported or extracted fossil fuels will need to be verifiably stored back underground. So the geological storage operator, suddenly they have a business, they need to store CO2 in order to generate carbon storage certificates, which the extractor or importer needs to have a license to import or extract more fossil fuels. So the extractor or the importer would pay the geological storage operator to dispose of CO2, and the government has a role obviously in verifying that everything is done this way. So that the pink and red arrows show the embedded costs and the actual payments that are made for these transactions. As we ramp up the fraction we store, we're probably going to run out of industrial point sources at some point, maybe in the 2030s or so. And at that point, we'd have to resort to capturing carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere. And that's where this direct air capture operator comes in, further supplying a higher proportion of CO2 to the geological storage operator to allow the extractor importer to continue selling their products. And finally, we reach 100% stored fraction, net zero emissions to the atmosphere, and all of the carbon dioxide that is still being produced by either consumers or industrial point sources will be being captured and re-injected back underground. Surprisingly, this looks very, well, perhaps surprisingly, particularly for economists who are sort of wedded to the idea of carbon taxes as the only way of addressing climate change, carbon takeback looks remarkably affordable. If we assume that the cost per ton of CO2 sequestered starts off at the cost of capture from refineries or whatever, which is only around $50 per ton of CO2, and increases progressively to closer to $300 per ton of CO2 by the time we reach net zero, because that's more like a cost for direct air capture, then the implied cost per ton of CO2 sold, so that's the equivalent carbon price to the consumer, is a multiple of whatever the actual cost of disposing of CO2 is, multiplied by the fraction that you need to dispose of. So if the sequestered fraction is only 10%, you're only paying 10% of the capture cost. And so what this translates to is a carbon price that's still, less than $10 per ton of CO2 in 2030, because of course you're only paying 10% of the capture costs. And this is explicitly to address the problem first pointed out to me by David Hone many years ago, that if you rely on a carbon price to incentivize CCS, you get no CCS at all until the carbon price is above the full cost of CCS, and then in principle you get lots, but by that time it's too late to deploy it. So it's to try and force in the deployment of CCS through a regulation. And we've done some work recently in a dual paper published late last year and led by Stuart Jenkins, comparing the cost of complying with a carbon takeback obligation with conventional ambitious mitigation scenarios that achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And in this conventional scenario, everything depends on a rising global carbon price, which we find increases to much more than the cost of even free air capture of carbon dioxide in order to get to net zero. And this may seem strange. Why does the carbon price go that high? It's because in the integrated assessment model, it's assumed, probably correctly, that we don't build carbon storage capacity fast enough to actually meet the demand. And so the carbon prices have to go far above the cost even of free air capture to get emissions to net zero. If we introduce a carbon takeback obligation, combine it with a constant carbon price, we get a better outcome, lower net emissions to the atmosphere, and a lower cost. You'll notice that in the equivalent carbon price panel down in the corner there, the yellow line's consistently below the blue one. So in context, and just to advertise the fact that this is feasible, we can look at the cost of compliance with a carbon takeback obligation compared to recent fossil fuel prices, all expressed per ton of carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere. And you can see the purple bar there is the range of costs from that Goldman report for point source capture and disposal. The green bar is for free air capture. And you can see that these costs are manageable relative to the costs of even quite recent fossil fuel wholesale price fluctuations. So scaling this, so ramping this in over 30 years would not be particularly traumatic for the world economy. So just to sum up, we need to get to the point where we've got net zero stuff. Rather than thinking about net zero systems or net zero companies, net zero countries, we need to think about decarbonizing 4 products. And these obviously are coal, gas, oil, and cement. And on average, the cost of decarbonization will be less than wholesale price variations of those products over the past 6 months. Progressive decarbonization through a carbon takeback obligation is, I would argue, in the long-term interests of the fossil fuel industry itself and the investors in that industry, because it relieves the risk of stranded fossil assets. And I leave you with the question, perhaps handing over to Margriet to explain, why aren't we talking about climate change in this way? And I think Margriet has got some answers to that question and some suggestions for how we can move the conversation on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Myles. An excellent introduction. I think Margriet is going to be sharing her slides. I know it always takes a minute for the system to catch up when you're sharing a screen.
Okay, I'm trying.
That's fine. Yeah,
great.
We can see it.
I'll see if I can
Just
get
need
it
to go
on
in
the.
full page. Perfect.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
take
working.
it away, Margriet.
I don't see anything else anymore, but I think that's fine. Yeah. Well, great introduction, Myles. In the Netherlands, we've done Carbon Take. Maybe I introduce myself first. My name is Margriet Kuiyper. I worked for Shell actually until 2016, partly in CCS also. And since 2016, I've been doing consulting work on carbon management, CCS. And for the last 2 years, I've been leading carbon takeback studies in the Netherlands. Basically, and that's what I want to talk about today. And the study started really from a societal context, so I'll go into that first. We did the first study in 2020. I'll say a bit about that, and we're busy wrapping up the second study actually. And I'll say a bit about how you can scale it up, what we think is of course needed. The societal context, I think, is, yeah, everybody who's working in the oil and gas industry knows this already. A couple of years ago, it became clear that there was more and more tension between the continued need and demand for fossil energy and the need to actually ramp down fossil energy use because of the carbon budgets and the climate impact of fossil energy. As a result, I think in the West, there's been less and less interest in new projects. We've become in Europe more dependent on Russia. And I think the war in the Ukraine has shown what that means. It actually means that we have a serious problem now because we're overly dependent on a couple of large resource holders like Russia. And I think similar things could be said about the Middle East, of course. And if you look at reports from like the IEA, they actually predict that over time, if we would use just the cheapest proven reserves, then the world as a whole would become more and more dependent on the large resource holders like Russia and the Middle East. And I think we've been ignoring that problem a bit, and now we're reminded that that's actually a serious issue, and that has increased the tensions and the polarization, I think, around the discussion about fossil energy production, which you see summarized in some of these headlines over the last month, basically. Because, of course, Europe is desperately looking for alternative gas and oil supplies, and the United States would like to supply some. Africa is interested, and we are looking at our own production again. But IPCC report last month very clearly said the continued installation of unabated fossil fuel infrastructure will lock in greenhouse gas emissions. And that lock-in concern is something that that's the main concern when you talk about fossil energy and CCS. So how will we address that? The last comment on the bottom is a bit what Europe is thinking about. Well, maybe if we start with LNG, we can convert it to hydrogen. So you get the kind of aspirational statements about being hydrogen ready, a bit like coal power plants were supposed to be capture ready, but it's not very concrete yet. And that means that a lot of stakeholders really do not want new projects at the moment. Now, what does it lead to for oil and gas industry? I think it's summed up by uncertainty, because there's uncertainty about all these issues that are listed here, which means that it's actually very difficult to make the kind of large-scale investments that are needed, either for new fossil gas, fossil energy production, or for large CCS projects. So how can we address that? And I think that's yeah, that's one of the main reasons why I'm working on the carbon takeback obligation, because I think a carbon takeback obligation can help give that certainty that's needed to be able to continue to invest in fossil energy without having to worry about not meeting your emission reduction targets. So what have we done in the Netherlands over the last couple of years? We've set up, the main thing we've set up, I think, is a large stakeholder group. Recognizing that CCS is controversial, continued fossil energy production is controversial, at least in the Netherlands. We said we need to discuss this with a big group of stakeholders, from companies to investors, scientists, NGOs, financial experts. And the work was sponsored by the Ministry of Economic Affairs here and a couple of companies, Equinor, BP, but also the producer companies in the Netherlands and the state mining company. And we had 4 long stakeholder sessions in which we tried to understand what would a carbon takeback obligation mean for fossil carbon production, import and use in the Netherlands. And one of the main things we produced, and it seems maybe not very important, but it's proven to be very helpful, is an agreement between all these different stakeholders on the objectives of a carbon takeback obligation. Why would you want to do that? And the most important objective is to provide a mechanism that ensures that emissions from any remaining fossil carbon use are net zero by 2050. So basically more certainty that you will meet the emission reduction targets, even if you need more fossil energy than you maybe hoped. But that's through the carbon takeback obligation, you have that certainty. The next one is a simple and transparent mechanism to ensure that new decisions include the necessary conditions to be Paris compliant. And I think that's important for companies and the government, because every new permit gets challenged these days in court. And if you have a condition like a carbon takeback requirement in a new permit, it's far easier to demonstrate that the production, the emissions from new development will indeed fit within the carbon budget. And the third one is actually the one that originally started the work, the lack of a proper long-term business model for CCS. NGOs didn't like the subsidy business model, and companies kind of like the subsidy business model, but for the longer term, they need more certainty. They don't want to be dependent on the subsidy, and every new government could cancel or increase or reduce the subsidy. So they also were interested in a more long-term business model. Boundary conditions will be no surprise to you. The NGOs very firmly say it should not slow down the transition, lock-in of fossil energy. Companies, of course, said it should not make the Netherlands less attractive. They wanted a level playing field for their investments. And then there's a lot of general boundary conditions for any policy, I think. We looked at a lot of design options and checked the different choices you can make in these design options. We discussed them in the context of the objectives that we agreed, and that led to some basic features of a carbon takeback obligation as we chose in the Netherlands. And I have to say, different options could satisfy the objective, so not all of them are hard requirements, and some people may have other preferences. But the placement, we said it should be as high up as possible in the value chain, so the producer or the importer of the fossil energy. It should be mandatory, because in the end, that's the only way to get the ball rolling fast enough and to keep a level playing field. And an important one, I think, is only permanent storage. So we decided, NGOs and companies alike, that carbon storage units can only be created by permanent carbon storage. So storage by growing trees or in agricultural soils would not be allowed as carbon storage unit under a carbon takeback obligation. As Myles said, the customers would be paying basically a carbon storage surcharge, a small amount. In the Netherlands, that would be around 1 cent per cubic meter of gas, by 2030. So it's very little indeed. So as Myles saying, you need to supplement it with a carbon price to make sure that emission reductions go quickly enough in the early years. And after 2030, in the Netherlands, the CSUs would be sold on an open market. We focused in the Netherlands on fossil gas, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, of course, in the Netherlands, we're really a gas country. We use a lot of gas, and we expect to be using that for quite a long time still, but also worldwide. If you look worldwide, natural gas in 2050, and even in the net zero scenarios, is often still around 40–50% of the current use of natural gas. And in other scenarios, it can be as high as fossil gas use in this year. So that means that a lot of fossil gas will be used in the next coming decades. And that means it's very important that that is used in a different way. And it's also an economic opportunity if you can develop the technologies and demonstrate how you can use fossil gas without a lot of emissions, then that's going to be important in the rest of the world too. In any country with a good natural gas reserve should be interested in this technology. And gas, as you probably all know, is easily converted to electricity or hydrogen or ammonia. And if you store the CO2, then basically you have the energy carriers of the future, also of the green economy, but then made with fossil energy for as long as we don't have enough green energy. The study we're doing at the moment is focused on legal and regulatory issues. I can't say too much about that yet. The report is expected in the coming months. So before the summer, there will be a final report in which you can read the results. We've done a more detailed economic impact assessment. The economic impact, both in the short term, if we implement it just in the Netherlands, and in the longer term, if it's implemented in Europe. And we've done more stakeholder engagement, basically, especially also at international level, because in the end, of course, it needs to be implemented in a larger region. And we hope that the North Sea countries would be the first to implement it. This picture I wanted to show to you because very often people say, well, does a carbon takeback obligation lead to more or less fossil energy use? And then NGOs hope you say less and companies hope you say more. And the answer is it depends on what your baseline is, what you compare it with. If you look at this graph, it's from a McKinsey report, but there's many graphs like this. You can see that for a 1.5 degree pathway, we should be reducing gas consumption right now already and go down significantly towards 2050. But we are actually more on the purple line, and we hope to get on the blue or the light blue line, and with a bit of luck we can reduce it further. But if you add a carbon takeback obligation to that mix, what will happen basically is that you encourage reduced gas use, because you will start increasing the price of gas when the percentages start going higher, above 50–60%, and the price goes up quite quickly. So you reduce the demand for gas. You encourage conversion to hydrogen electricity with CCS, and you ensure that remaining emissions are offset with ducts or with biomass and CO2 storage. So in the end, then you get a line a bit like the red line, fossil gas with carbon takeback obligation, which means that you will use a bit more gas than in the 1.5 degree pathway, but you'll use less gas than in the other pathways. So it's and there is more certainty, because in the end, in 2050, you still use quite a bit of gas, but with a carbon takeback obligation, that will be fully compensated if it's at 100% by either storage of the fossil gas or compensation by ducts or biomass and storage. I'm going to skip this one. If somebody wants to know about scaling up, they can ask me, because I want to do this one, the concluding. In conclusion, I think fossil energy producers who are serious about Paris compliance, and a lot of fossil energy companies are saying that they are serious and net zero by 2050, but they also want to continue supplying fossil energy as long as there is demand. And there is a tension between those two, and that tension needs to be resolved. So I think if you are serious about both those things, you have to get serious about upgrading your product to the 21st century. And what do I mean by upgrading your product? I mean, invest in R&D projects, etc., to demonstrate and improve low carbon technologies, basically. Clean up your act. There's too much bad examples still of methane, orphan wells, health impacts, community investments. I need a damage compensation. So that needs to be done better. Include decarbonization requirements in contracts. So if you're selling LNG or purchasing energy, include carbon emission requirements. I think that is starting to happen, but it should be scaled up more. But the most important thing I think you should be doing is lobbying for tough regulations to make sure that unabated fossil energy, especially in new projects, progressively becomes a thing of the past. You need a level playing field you can compete on. So the tough regulations, I know it's instinctively goes against the grain, but you need it to be able to survive the coming decades with fossil energy as a decarbonized product. And the carbon takeback obligation, of course, we think could be such a tough regulation that will help the producers with the incentives to make these changes, and hopefully result in societal support for the role fossil energy companies can play in reducing the fossil energy emissions. Thank you.
Margriet, excellent, thank you. So we'll now move from discussion about an obligation and regulatory approach in one guise, and then think about how that can be supplemented and how it can be interaction with market-based mechanisms for carbon storage units, such as the Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. And I'll hand over to Arthur and Martin, and if you can stick to your 20 minutes, that would be much appreciated. And whilst you're getting your slides up, which I can see, there is one person who still has his video camera on. I won't mention who you are, but if everyone can check their video camera on their laptop and switch it off if you're not presenting, that would be really appreciated. So take it away, Arthur and Martin.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you, the colleagues Myles Allen and Margriet Kuiyper. Excellent show so far. Let me introduce myself a little bit. Jim Herbertson, when he introduced IPECA, IPECA's first roundtable or workshop, actually, a full-fledged workshop on CCS was 2003. I was actually there. I think looking through the list, I may be the one or two people who were there from that time. So it has been almost 20 years, and I remember very clearly. Even then, we had great presentation from people like Sam Holloway, for example, British Geologic Survey. We're all learning about some of the technologies and the geological sciences around CCS, but we were also starting to really think hard about policy. And of course, this is, in a sense, this is what this today's webinar is about. It's about policy, and it's also about carbon market policy, because even then in 2003, it was just 2 years before the effectiveness, the going into effect of the EU ETS. And so we were also at the time, IPECA 2 held workshops around the ETS also, EU ETS. So these things are all converging, and in the case of CCS, there was also the international component, as we have observed beginning to observe how countries really do need to not only cooperate on all kinds of emission reduction technologies, but and that could come from project-based mechanisms or from international emission trading that was under the Kyoto Protocol and under the joint joint implementation mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. Now, that's all ancient history to, I'm sure, to many of you. That's still very fresh in my own mind, having seen all that, because some of the same people, if you don't mind, Martin, going to the next slide. I should also acknowledge Ronaldo De Filippo of ENI, who is a co-author of this and also really co-led this effort. And especially Ronaldo is also the Carbon Offset Task Force of IPECA. Okay, so on this slide, you can now see we're talking about Article 6. That's the Paris Agreement. So now with the convergence of CCS technology and the Paris Agreement, we're talking about the ability to really have this be a much more of an internationalized, globalized process. Under the Kyoto Protocol, that was already there was already that globalized nature to how we could do CCS, but still that took almost I think it took 6 years, at least 6 COPs, to get that into the clean development mechanism, a project-based global mechanism for doing emission reduction projects under the Kyoto Protocol. So some of the architects of that, some of the people who push for that, are some of the same people that we hired as OGCI, that we hired to do a study with us and for us in OGCI. These included Andre Marcoux, people who are veterans, negotiators, and also Paul Zakour from Carbon Counts, and people in CAPSARC like Wolf Heiduck, who was used to be formerly with Shell and now with CAPSARC, and also Peter Zeman, an attorney based in Singapore. These are folks that the 3 folks that we hired them to work with us as well to think about Article 6 now with CCS and how that could work. Now, Article 6, of course, opens up this whole new world with 6.2 and 6.4 as well, paragraph 2 and paragraph 4. Paragraph 2 allows countries to form emission trading clubs, and paragraph 4, of course, is project-based, just like the CDM. So I'm certainly hoping that the CDM eligibility for CCS will just be carried over with of course full approval right into Article 6.4 mechanism. At the same time, 6.2 allows countries to really broaden their approaches of cooperation on regulations, on trading, of course, anything that where they can set a cap over the group of countries, they can then trade under the cap with corresponding adjustments. So CCS certainly could fit very well in this. And then now I'm turning it over to Martin Towns so that he can explain more about how the OGCI is thinking about this. Martin.
Thanks very much, Arthur. So as Arthur said, one of the reasons we've been thinking about Article 6 in particular is because we recognise that, as Myles has said, this would be very good if it could be implemented in large jurisdictions, multiple countries, but not all countries can store, and not all countries can store at the same price. And so some mechanisms for international cooperation could really accelerate things. Before I get into the meat of this, let me introduce myself. Martin Towns, BP Senior Advisor for CCUS, and in this webinar representing the OGCI. I think the main thing I can say is that the ideas that Myles and Margriet have already shared with us do have serious traction among the members of the OGCI. So this is something that we've discussed extensively, commissioned this particular report into, and are working on and thinking how we can support some of the underlying building blocks that would enable this as a useful policy mechanism to address climate change. I won't dwell long on each of these slides because Myles and Margriet have covered much of it, and I think it's probably more important that the people on the call get the opportunity to ask them questions. But just to say that the world has mostly focused to date on atmospheric carbon stock, so emissions into the atmosphere, removals from the atmosphere. But the reverse side of that coin is carbon in and out of the geosphere. And so just as Margriet has described, most efforts to reduce production, reduce carbon from the geosphere, net flow out of the geosphere, have been about absolute reductions in production rather than growth in the ratio of storage to production. And that's something that we can address with a carbon storage obligation. I'll just mention the difference in the name. In the OGCI, we call it the carbon storage obligation rather than carbon takeback. It is the same thing. It just is a more useful name for us, given that we want to show that we're not necessarily putting back the exact same carbon that we supplied. Two things that are necessary for CSU-based carbon storage unit-based market mechanisms to work are, of course, supply and demand. Myles has described how that demand can be created with a carbon storage obligation. It could also be created with voluntary targets around storage. Some companies have done that. Some large independent oil and gas companies have done that, but we think to really drive significant action and large scale uptake, it would be regulated. And so a country can take carbon storage into its NDCs, and then it can devolve that to the private sector using carbon storage obligation, as Myles and Margriet have already described. CSU supply, well, this is where industries like the oil and gas industry can play a significant role in the execution of storage projects, not exclusively, but it does fit with the oil and gas industry's expertise in engineering, subsurface management, major projects, and value chain coordination, all strengths of the industry. For international exchange of CSUs, we would need a few things. Standards for certifying storage. We would think that's best drawn from existing rule books. Arthur's already mentioned the first ones of these, the IPC 2006, and the CDM mechanism. There's also the International Standard Organizations mechanisms and national laws and regulations. So an awful lot to draw on there. Carbon storage units would be issued by central agencies who would be able to verify storage under those defined protocols and use a registry for tracking them and, of course, cancelling them against obligations met as they're surrendered to balance fossil carbon supplied into a market. And governance will depend upon the national and local approach. Just a little bit more on voluntary markets. So many corporations have net zero pledges. There is the potential for aligned companies to agree to use CSUs. I think the first step of that is reporting carbon stored, and for companies to increasingly do that as part of their sustainability reports. And then many companies, including many members of the OGCI, have made corporate pledges to deliver net zero. They're not a voluntary contribution or commitment is not exclusive to regulatory. So regulatory mechanisms help organizations to meet those commitments that they've pledged, and in fact are the enablers for them. And then in terms of regulation around Article 6 cooperation, Margriet's already mentioned the possibility of a club, and we think that that's very helpful. There could be lead countries who take up carbon storage obligations first and then work together to partly internationalize that market, and then that can grow over time under Article 6.2 mechanisms. Just a slide on points of departure. So So far, stakeholder acceptance has been challenged because everyone's been focused on emissions rather than actual carbon supplied and stored. And that can change. And I think there's lots of work going on taxonomy now that can begin to address storage. NGOs do sometimes think that if the CCS industry grows quickly, then that kind of locks in fossil fuels. I think if you were to set absolute targets on storage, then there's an element of truth in that argument. However, just like Myles has described, ratios do not lock in fossil fuels. They lock in a ratio of abatement, and that abatement increases to 100%, while fossil fuel usage overall can continue to decline. And very importantly, CSUs can be important enablers in commercial mechanisms for removals, such as BECCS and DAC, because both rely on carbon to be stored, and therefore both of those, as well as creating carbon removal credits, can also create carbon storage units. Corporate buy-in, I think more and more management organizations, investors, shareholders are seeking greater nuance around what it means to be net zero. And I think this aspect of increasing the amount of carbon stored relative to supplied is a key element of that organizations can use. And then I'll just say something about government buying. So far, no governments have seriously proposed carbon storage obligations, although they have been proposed to governments, for example, by Ron Oxburgh in the United Kingdom. But I think that this type of work shows how useful they can be. And I'll just finish by illustrating that using the UK as an example. So here's a graph that shows how much CO2 will be produced by the oil and gas supplied to the UK market based on the UK government's projection out to 2050, which is a CCC net zero compliant case. And then the green line on here shows the obligation to store increasing over time, just as Myles said, 10% in 2030, 50 in 2040, 100% by 2050. And then the yellow line is the resultant growth of a carbon capture and storage industry. And the good thing I think that you can see about that yellow line is it actually tracks predictable growth, relatively steady growth. For the UK, it would plateau more or less by mid-century. It would allow a national supply chain to be built up as projects are predictably brought online, and it fits very well with both the government's targets for 2030 of 20 to 30 million tonnes per annum being stored by that time, and with the CCC's recommendation for 2050, which is around 100 million tonnes per annum. So it really delivers what the government would be looking for, and I think that's very helpful. So with that, let me stop and then return to Jim and open to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Arthur and Martin, and thanks to all of the presenters for pretty much keeping on time. That's much appreciated. We have 10 minutes for questions. So again, you can either put your hand up or go into the chat box. I see that Myles has put a point into the chat box about reporting, and I mention that because it's one of my favourite mantras. We could only manage what we measure. So please remember that. So that's a really important concept to take home. But whilst people are kind of deciding their questions and putting their hand up, if I could start, it's probably with Margriet and Myles. And there's a lot of discussion from what I call the carbon capture and storage industry around clusters and hubs to spare CCS deployment. And sort of how does a carbon takeback obligation deal with or help with that kind of emerging business model? You're on mute.
Do you want to go for that, Margriet, or shall I?
Well, I can say we can both say something probably, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, the main point is it provides the customer, and so I think the big concern we have in the UK is that the initial taxpayer-funded clusters may not survive government appetite for spending government money on this. And we need an off-ramp for the government subsidies there, and the carbon takeback obligation would provide that. I mean, Margriet probably is closer to the actual hub discussions in the Netherlands. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think in general that's the way we see it, that it's useful for governments to put money in a few initial projects so that they're real public-private partnerships. And how it develops after that really is a bit up to the companies also. So you can also you can have different models. In the Netherlands, for example, the state companies are doing transport and storage, and it could well be that companies will join together and say, we'll keep paying you to further develop transport and storage networks and sell us the carbon storage units. So that would be a model in which there is a joint transport and storage company who basically tries to optimize the transport and storage hubs for everybody to buy their carbon storage units from them. And that could be private, it could be public, because some countries, they prefer it to be public and some countries prefer it to be private. But I think in general, you should always leave the option for innovation and for cost reduction, and therefore for companies also to switch to converting gas into hydrogen and selling hydrogen instead of gas, for example. So then they do their own storage and they need to purchase less carbon storage units on the open market. So there will be a hybrid at some point, I think.
And just to add to that, of course, the key thing the carbon takeback obligation provides that an ETS or carbon price does not provide is quantity certainty in the amount of storage that will be required, certainly in the short term. I mean, of course, in the long term, it depends on how much fossil fuels we use, but we kind of know what 10% of UK all scope emissions is going to look like in 2030. So that helps in terms of crowding in investment into this, and that people see that they will be able to sell this CO2 storage, and therefore there will be we would hope a rush to invest rather than just sort of an after you effect.
Thanks. Again, I'm looking, there is a question the chat box will come to in a second, but please feel free to put your hand up in the audience if you do have a question.
We don't bite.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it kind of starts with kind of from Martin's presentation, but it's a question that's sort of open to all the panelists. And it's this, the what I call the delivery mechanism for the Paris Agreement are the nationally determined contributions and the mid-century or long-term greenhouse gas strategies. And as we've seen from the IEA, the net zero roadmap, partnerships and collaboration are essential. If you don't have international cooperation, then getting to net zero is delayed by decades, not 2050, but 2070, 2080. So how can carbon capture and storage, carbon dioxide removal be enhanced with Article 6 or with carbon takeback within these revised NDCs and in the run-up to COP26, which is it? We've got kind of 6-9 months before COP27, sorry. And how can the people on the line and everyone work together in partnership to try and raise the profile and get these things moving forward? So I don't know who wants to answer that. Probably start with you, Martin, because it was kind of referred to in your presentation.
Yes, sure. So I mean, I totally agree that cooperation is necessary. I think a few things. One, we need to see more governments putting CCS into their NDCs. It's a very small subset that have done that so far, but it's growing. More can certainly do it. I think one of the hesitancies that governments have is this question of who will pay for it. Well, one of the things that a carbon storage obligation can do is it can allow richer, more developed countries to be the purchasers of carbon storage units, allowing carbon to be stored in diverse locations. There is, of course, this question around controlling that. It's not any type of storage counts. It will be need to meet a specifically high standard, and that's why I think those who are on this call and work with organizations like IPECA, like the IOGP, the OGCI, and others, we can help create those universal high standards so that a carbon storage unit is a reliable unit that people know what it means and have confidence in, so that when it is internationally traded, you're always getting the quality that you expect to pay for. Let me stop there and pass to others.
I see that Arthur has his hand up. Go ahead with your question, Arthur.
Not a question, but to address your question, Jim. And I certainly echo what, build on what Martin had said. People who know me know I'm not some visionary. I'm just a plodder. I plod. I slog through things. So people who know me knows that. And so I want to refer back to what I said earlier about the CDM, about the Kyoto Protocol. I know, again, that's ancient history to many in the audience. But at the same time, that we have to live in the world of policy enablement of this technology. And the CDM itself, even though it's quite pedestrian, quite small, it seems, we have to make sure, the first thing we got to make sure is that the CDM actually transfer that kind of methodology for CCS eligibility, about reporting, about international cooperation. All of that is actually in the CDM to get that into the Paris Agreement Article 6.4 mechanism, as well as understanding and advocating for countries themselves to, as what Martin said, about NDCs, really get them to recognize NDCs. But even little things that we took 6 years, many of us took 6 years out of our lives to get that into the CDM, that hopefully should be ported over. And it's those little building blocks that I think will get us there. Now, of course, that's what I said. I'm not a visionary, I just plod. And it took a lot of slogging to even get that done. So we'll see how it works. But certainly, I'm optimistic that we'll get it done. Thanks.
Thank you, Arthur. And I see there's a comment in the chat box recognizing that consistent plodding in the right direction is probably a virtuous thing to have. Can I then there's another question I've got in my mind, and it builds on the discussion here, because Myles, you mentioned that ramping up a carbon take-back obligation may be better than a carbon price for the reasons you mentioned. And then Martin talked about clubs of countries. And I was thinking that how can you get that whole thing to work in one jurisdiction, be it the United States or perhaps Europe, getting someone to think, I'll not do a carbon price, I'll do a carbon take-back obligation. I'll get clubs of countries to work together. And then I started thinking about another thing that people talk about, which is the border carbon adjustment mechanism. And would you need one of those to go with your carbon take-back obligation if you could get these countries to agree? I don't know. So I'll start with Myles is kind of indicating. So go ahead, Myles.
Yeah, well, these are obviously things we're thinking about a lot. First of all, we wouldn't suggest a carbon take-back obligation is an alternative to a carbon price or other demand management mechanisms. I might have said that once upon a time, but I think now we recognize that we need both, because if you simply introduce a carbon take-back obligation and then just sort of say, let everything happen, you find that there's no incentive for people to reduce emissions in the short term, and you end up with an impossibly large storage commitment in the longer term. So that's the sort of response to that. And in response to formation of clubs and the need for carbon border adjustments, the incremental cost, if you have got a carbon pricing mechanism in place, the incremental cost of adding a carbon take-back obligation to it is pretty minimal up until 2030 or 2035. So beyond that, you'd have to start worrying about whether your trading partners also had carbon take-back obligations in place. But up until that point, it really wouldn't matter. And in the end, compared to a carbon border adjustment mechanism, I would argue that the question of, are you using net zero compliant fossil fuels is a much simpler one to answer than a question, what is the carbon content exactly of this iPhone, which could turn into a real nightmare when we actually start sort of trying to work out carbon border adjustment mechanisms for all traded goods around the world. So I actually think this will be a much simpler regulation in the long term as we approach net zero to ensure that everybody's on track to net zero, because it's a simple binary outcome. Are you getting rid of the carbon or are you not? And that makes it a much simpler thing to propagate around the world economy.
Perfect. I don't see more questions in with people with their hands up, and I think that's a really strong point, perhaps on which to finish. The concept of net zero compliant fuels or net zero compliant oil and gas in the marketplace. So it just rests for me to say thank you very much to our presenters, to Myles, to Margriet, to Martin and Arthur. Thank you very much to everyone who's on the line for taking the time out, listening to the presentations. And as mentioned earlier, we'll have a recording of the webinar and a link to the PDF version of the slides, and we'll send that to all registrants, those who made it live and those who make it on catch up and on demand. So that's been really fascinating. I've got a lot to think about. So thanks again to the presenters, and for the rest of everyone, have a great rest of the week and stay safe. So goodbye and thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.